You're listening to Autumn on the Air, the weekly podcast that brings you conversations about the impact of research commercialization and the people who make it happen. Join us for interviews with patent and licensing professionals, innovators, entrepreneurs, and tech transfer leaders on the issues and trends that matter most. Keep listening for an inside track on the people, IP policies, and politics changing our world.
Welcome to Autumn on the Air. I'm your host, Lisa Mueller. The WTO Doha Declaration on TRIPS Agreement and Public Health, adopted by the WTO members in 2001, aided in framing the intellectual property system's health policy. It emphasized the importance of the WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, also known as the TRIPS Agreement, as part of broader national and international action to address public health issues affecting development and least developed countries. Internationally, the World Trade Organization will have to reach a decision by December 17th on whether to extend the current TRIPS waiver on COVID-19 vaccines to cover therapeutics and diagnostics as well. An extension of the TRIPS waiver will stifle innovation in all industries that rely heavily on research because it will convey the idea that IP protections for their discoveries can be removed at any time. Today, Patrick Kilbride joins us on the air to talk about what this expansion would mean for innovation and the precedent it would set. Patrick Kilbride is the Senior Vice President of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Global Innovation Policy Center. He manages a team of country and regional specialists to supervise the country's multilateral and worldwide activities supporting the preservation and enforcement of intellectual property rights. Welcome, Patrick. I'm really excited to welcome you to the podcast today.
Thank you, Lisa. Great to be with you. I'm a huge fan.
Great to have you here. And there's so much going on right now with respect to intellectual property, TRIPS waiver, March-in rights that I wanted to talk with you today about the TRIPS waiver. But before we get there, I wanted to ask you, for some of our listeners who may not be overly familiar, can you explain a little bit about how TRIPS came to be and what its original purpose was?
Absolutely. This is a very timely conversation, Lisa, because as your listeners may know, there was a waiver of commitments under the TRIPS agreement agreed to by members of the World Trade Organization back in June that covered vaccines for the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, the same organization, the World Trade Organization, is debating the extension of that waiver to COVID therapeutics and diagnostics. So this is all about the agreement on intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization that was first entered into force in January 1, 1995. And it's one of three pillar agreements of the WTO that also includes trade in goods and trade in services. And the TRIPS agreement was meant to be a floor, not a ceiling. That is, it is explicitly under the terms of the agreement, a set of minimum standards that countries should implement in their national laws and regulations to provide a certain set of intellectual property rights to other trading partners. And so this was intended to build the foundation for a global rules-based intellectual property system, much along the lines of what we have in the United States and other advanced countries. And I think one of the challenges from the outset was that the intellectual property commitments that were agreed to by WTO members were viewed for the most part as a concession. So you think about, middle income and less developed countries, they wanted access to wealthy markets like the U.S. market. They wanted reductions in agricultural subsidies, but they really didn't want intellectual property rules because, by and large, they viewed intellectual property as something that forced them to pay someone else. They were in the position, and many continue to be in the position of being what they would describe as net importers of intellectual property. And so, they saw this as a disadvantage and a concession, not as a benefit of the rules-based multilateral trading system.
Yeah, and there have been some interesting aspects to TRIPS over time as it relates to pharmaceuticals, in particular, some countries implementing more stringent requirements and rules for pharmaceuticals versus other countries. So it's been interesting just to watch kind of the evolution of TRIPS over time. And that brings me to the IP waiver that I want to talk to you about. Because earlier this year, the World Trade Organization suspended certain TRIPS waiver obligations and therefore IP protections for the COVID-19 vaccine in developing WTO member nations. What led to this decision, and do you think it was even necessary at the time?
The decision to waive certain commitments under the TRIPS agreement was, I believe, the outgrowth of this continued misunderstanding, sometimes willful, of how intellectual property rights actually contribute to economic activity. Going back to my comment a moment ago, many countries do continue, even advanced developed economies, continue to view themselves as net importers of intellectual property, which puts you in a very awkward position with respect to commitments to protect intellectual property of your trading partners. The way that we talk about IP at the Chamber is in terms of its enabling functions. So first of all, we believe that the high degree of legal certainty associated with intellectual property rights in the United States enables businesses to look out over a long time horizon and invest in high risk, capital intensive, innovative, and creative activity that they otherwise would not be able to invest in, for the simple reason that we operate within competitive financial markets where resources need to be allocated to different projects. And those high risk, innovative projects simply won't be financed unless there's a clear opportunity for a return on investment when successful. And we know that, and you mentioned the pharmaceutical industry a moment ago, we know that many innovative investments are not successful. In fact, 9 out of 10 drugs entering clinical trials fail to ever make it to market as a medicine that could either help a patient or provide a return on investment to the innovator. So it's just tremendously important that IP rights are available to fill this function if we want to have those advanced technologies available, such as the COVID-19 vaccines, in a pandemic situation, or to extrapolate to other industries if we want the technologies that are going to adequately address things like energy shortages and climate change and food production. But the other, and to me almost equally important function that I see of intellectual property rights in the economy is that it sort of serves as that connective tissue between different stakeholders within the innovation ecosystem. So when you're looking at the broad range of players who need to contribute to the life cycle of innovation from very early, early stage scientific research through to development of products and testing and regulatory approval and commercialization and everything else that goes into that innovation life cycle, you need to connect, myriad participants. Intellectual property provides a means for those stakeholders to come to the table together, to understand who's bringing what, to agree on a value, even if we can't always accurately assess the value of a given intellectual property asset, but they have to come to terms, and IP rights enable that in a very clear, legally enforceable way. And so it enables that contractual relationship among stakeholders. And I think, this is a very long-winded way of answering your question, so forgive me, but if we can help more economies around the world see the opportunity from intellectual property instead of seeing it as a cost that they pay back to innovators in wealthier countries, then we will turn around this IP waiver debate and create the conditions where countries are looking at the TRIPS agreement, for instance, as an investment in a domestic legal and economic infrastructure that allows them to succeed in a 21st century knowledge economy. Whereas today, they take the view that intellectual property rights are a cost being imposed on them.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right on that. And I think it's interesting because there was recently a WTO communication in which the governments of Mexico and Switzerland actually reported that no developing WTO nation availed themselves of the waiver since it came down in June.
That's exactly right. And there's good reasons for that, right? We really don't believe that the waiver was necessary to either accelerate discovery and development of solutions like vaccines and therapeutics, or that it was helpful in any way or needed in terms of accelerating the distribution and equitable access to those solutions around the world. In fact, for all the reasons we've discussed over the last few minutes, intellectual property rights are sort of an essential role in getting those ideas out there, and even in technology transfer. And I think in terms of trade policy in the United States, we tend to think of technology transfer in terms of coerced or forced technology transfer, where maybe government entities are trying to quote unquote steal our technology. But I think you know this far better than I do, Lisa. In terms of how our own innovation ecosystem works, technology transfer is constant and organic and healthy. And it really runs a spectrum from, it's not always the transfer of fully developed technologies. In fact, it's more knowledge transfer and knowledge advancement, then becoming over time technology advancement and technology transfer in ways that we don't even see half the time. So, this idea that's out there in the world that, the capabilities of a Moderna could be transferred in whole cloth to other countries just seems ludicrous when you see how complex and dynamic our own innovation ecosystem is, and how technology transfer really works so well when you foster that ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, with the COVID-19 vaccines, it wasn't really transferring the technology. It was actually, how do you make these vaccines and transfer that information to be able to make those vaccines? So there was a lot of know-how wrapped up in that, which, like, to your point, a lot of people don't see.
Well, right. And, when you take a Moderna, for instance, we know how long it took for that company to get where it is. When you look at a BioNTech, you look at the path that they followed, and, important to reflect that in late 2019, before we recognized that we were, at the onset of a pandemic, those companies were both struggling to find capital to continue their research investment, and they may not have existed were it not for the pandemic. But it's because of the strength of our system that companies like that are able to continue to attract capital and continue to test new ideas. And and the idea that you could just take that and sort of clone it across different countries is almost laughable when you really see how the process works.
Yeah, exactly. And, we had this IP waiver relating to the vaccines back in June. And now the WTO is coming up on another deadline here on December 17th, where they're going to decide whether or not they should actually broaden this waiver for not only for vaccines, but to include medications and diagnostics. And it seems to me, if it really wasn't necessary to do it for the vaccines, it seems to me it doesn't appear to be necessary to do this for medications and diagnostics. What's your thought, Patrick?
Well, that just really, I think, makes the case for how political this conversation has been at the WTO. In the lead up to the 12th ministerial conference of the WTO that took place in June of 2022, where the vaccine waiver was agreed, we saw that the organization itself, the institution, was under duress, and that they were going to face a situation where they might not have any outcome at all. We've seen that the dispute settlement platform within the organization has now been effectively ceased to function for the last several years. So this was a moment of crisis for the WTO. And it seems apparent that many member states, including some of the strongest supporters of intellectual property, were more focused on preventing a breakdown of the institution than they were on protecting TRIPS. And so some efforts were made to compartmentalize and cabin the effects of the TRIPS waiver. And in fact, what ultimately happened could truthfully be termed more of a clarification of existing flexibilities than it was as originally proposed, a full-blown waiver of intellectual property commitments. But nevertheless, now in this renewed version of the debate affecting therapeutics and diagnostics, we're faced with the same situation where the facts on the ground don't in any way support a new waiver or new clarification of flexibilities, but there are still those political pressures, not as urgent perhaps on an institutional basis with the WTO, but just in terms of the global context of equitable access to technology. Many of the same pressures are still there.
So, Patrick, let's assume that the WTO goes ahead and decides it's going to apply this waiver also to medications and diagnostics. What effect do you think that's going to have on innovation and research?
We're very concerned that any expansion of the waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics is likely to have a much bigger impact on the ability of industry to invest. And the reasons for that become fairly obvious when you look at the products that are likely to be targeted, because in the vaccine space, it was very clear that the target was mRNA, and it was a very focused desire to take that technology. In the therapeutic and diagnostic space, there are many, many technologies that are useful in terms of the ever-evolving standard of care that physicians use to treat COVID-19. These therapies are not all new. Some of them are. Many of them are repurposing of existing medicines, and so the implications are so far-ranging in terms of rights that currently exist that it really just does have a much wider potential impact. And then in a more forward-looking manner, my concern is that having approved a vaccine waiver in June, and then following that up with an extended waiver for therapeutics and diagnostics, that multilateral organizations like the WTO and the World Health Organization are then looking at a pandemic response treaty or pandemic response instrument, whereby they would identify intellectual property as a barrier to equitable access and lay the groundwork for routine waivers in the future. And the same debate is going on in organizations like the UN Forum on Climate Change. You see these proposals with the COP27 talks. And so it's very easy to see this waiver idea snowballing and becoming really an epidemic in its own right.
Yeah, and talk about weakening intellectual property all around the world then, because then where do you draw the line? If you're going from, a health emergency to climate change, you could probably make an argument for just about any technology at that point.
Exactly. And so at that point, international commitments really have no meaning.
Exactly. So you mentioned the politics of this with respect to the waiver. Is that really the push and the driver here to extend this waiver, or is there more to it than that?
It really, to me, the politics within the WTO are what enabled the original waiver to move forward and may contribute to the extension of the waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics if the WTO ultimately goes down that path. But the real driver to me is this utter misapprehension that has been driven by global activists, well-meaning, I'm sure, this idea that intellectual property is a payout to so-called big business in wealthy countries. And it does seem to me that we almost have to go back to 1994 when the original TRIPS agreement was being approved and readied for entry into force, and re-examine the basic conversation with the rest of the world about why we have intellectual property rights. If intellectual property was all about paying rich people, the United States would not have implemented its own system 200 years ago. There was a clear recognition that the system of rights enabled innovation from the masses, not from the aristocrats. The very premise was that they wanted to democratize invention, and that to do so, you had to create a system where regular people, tradesmen, craftsmen, could have the rights to their intellectual output. Otherwise, it's simply the independently wealthy who could afford to pursue scientific projects because they had the wherewithal to do things that might never pay out for them, that they might never see a return on investment from. The average Joe can't do that. The average Jane can't do that. They have to, feed their family, have a livelihood, and so they can't invest in their own intellectual output unless there's a means to own that output.
So, Patrick, we know with the vaccine waiver, the Biden administration supported the waiver. Where do they currently stand on this waiver for therapeutics and diagnostics?
I think it's important to take a step back in time when we, discuss the administration's support for the vaccine waiver. In January 2021, we were obviously at a critical time for the world in terms of the pandemic response. We were at the very initial stages of approving and distributing vaccines that were developed in record time. There was no clear path to being able to manufacture this at a global scale. And you had a new administration that was coming in following one that had been very domestically focused. And this new administration wanted to show to the world that it was taking a leadership role. Meantime, they're faced with the domestic reality of vaccinating 300 million Americans and being able to work with industry to manufacture those at scale, get them into the arms of American citizens, which is, let's face it, the U.S. administration's first responsibility. And so with that in mind, it's easy to see why a TRIPS waiver, why an IP waiver would seem like an attractive alternative to taking responsibility for vaccinating the world, which they really did not have the wherewithal to do. So in May 2021, you saw the new U.S. administration announce its support for a waiver of IP at the WTO for vaccines, and they were very clear throughout that entire debate that the support was for vaccines. And the U.S. has not taken a position on the extension of a waiver to therapeutics and diagnostics. And in fact, since June, we've seen many members of Congress on a bipartisan basis speak out publicly with letters to the administration, urging them to be very cautious in the approach to this extended waiver debate, and to consider all of the implications for U.S. technological leadership, for the workers and their jobs in our economy, and all of the downstream implications, since it does not appear that a waiver is in any way justified by the facts on the ground at this point.
So I can assume we're not going to hear anything on this between now and December 17th, it sounds like.
At first we were believing that the administration was unlikely to take a position before the elections. At this point, I would tend to agree, although I'll say that's purely speculation on my part, that we're not likely to see a firm position from the U.S. anytime soon. And that, one likely outcome is that the December 17 deadline that the WTO imposed on itself will likely be extended.
So, Patrick, what can the AUTM community do to stop the expansion of the TRIPS waiver and protect intellectual property rights?
What I love about the AUTM community is how well you represent the ecosystem. And I think that story just hasn't been told. I feel like those of us in industry, we say ecosystem to each other all the time, but even we don't really very often do the hard work of defining what that ecosystem is, what it looks like, who's part of it. We don't, connect it to the life cycle of innovation. We don't tell the story as well as we need to. And I think there's no one better positioned to tell that story than AUTM, in cooperation with partners in industry and government and, frankly, the financial community, venture capitalists, equity markets. We're all part of this. And we need to speak up. We need to help policymakers, make it accessible to them, how this ecosystem really works so that they can understand better the value of IP. Because right now, with the populist trends in society, but you see that reflected in both parties in Congress. We really face a very hostile environment for intellectual property, and it's essential for the world, but also for this innovation ecosystem that we turn that around.
Oh, absolutely. And Patrick, thank you for your time today, because this has been a really important and insightful conversation. And I can't thank you enough for bringing your expertise to the show today and for continuing to be a source of knowledge on this important topic for the tech transfer community. So thank you.
Well, thank you to you and AUTM for your great work. I'm a huge fan. Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Patrick. Well, that's a wrap for this week's show. Catch you next time on the air. I'm your host, Lisa Mueller, signing off for now.
Thanks for listening to AUTM on the Air with Lisa Mueller. Get social with us and share your thoughts. You can tweet us at AUTM or visit us online at AUTM.net. We'll be back next week on the air. Be sure to join us.
New to tech transfer or a seasoned pro? AUTM is the global member organization for tech transfer and is here to help you get connected, get smart, and get ahead. Whether you work in academia, research, government, business development, corporate engagement, or startups, AUTM is dedicated to supporting you through education, advocacy, networking, and promotion. Join and you'll receive 20 free live webinars, as well as meaningful discounts on meetings and courses, insider access to a vast network of colleagues to help you through challenges, and align on new technologies and the university decision makers who license them. Membership is open for 2023. Join us.